Is that a butthole? Gleba's a funny old place, isn't it? It rains all the time. Some of the local fauna looks like brains, while other bits explode when you get close to them. And the natives claim they're vegetarians, but they're not averse to stomping on a poor little engineer that's just trying to do a bit of farming. If you ask me, it's the perfect place for a relaxing holiday. One of the things that's interesting about the Nauvis system is that it's full of extremes. Fulgora is a barren wasteland that has been dead for millions of years. Perhaps it's a salutary lesson in the effects of unrestrained industrialisation and unchecked pollution. I have a video where I speculate about that, linked in the description. Vulcanus is a literal hellhole, where the crust is so thin that every impact causes a plume of lava to erupt. The planet is dominated by a single lifeform that's tough enough to survive the extremes of heat and a toxic atmosphere. It's basically quite close to an early primordial planet. However, given the apparent age of the Nauvis system, I suspect it's more to do with its proximity to the Nauvis star than anything else. But I'll talk about Vulcanus more in another video. Then there's Nauvis itself, which is a close Earth analogue, except there's this strange, hyper-aggressive lifeform that views everything as a threat, responds to any pollution it senses, and evolves at a frankly alarming speed. I've already done a video about those weird little creatures, link in the description as well. Aquilo is perhaps the simplest and most stable of the planets, but it is a place of extremes as well. The temperatures are super low, and it's covered in an ocean of ammonia. I don't think Bob, the shattered planet, really counts since it's a rogue planet, but broken into pieces is about as extreme as things get. And then there's Gleba, where it appears almost everything is biological. Almost everything, or actually everything? That's right, today, finally, at long last, we're going to dive headfirst into the squishy and squelchy recesses of Gleba. Gleba. Before we get started on the flora and fauna, let's have a quick look at what the game actually says about Gleba. Factoriopedia describes Gleba as, quote, a humid, swampy planet with deep bogs, snaking hills and fertile land, rich in nutrients. There are a couple of notable characteristics about Gleba. It's got a gravity of 20 metres per second squared. This is double Earth's, and note that Nauvis is about the same as Earth. It's also got a surface air pressure of 2,000 hectopascals, which is also double that of Earth's. Those stats suggest it's a bigger planet than Nauvis or Earth. However, it also states Gleba has a magnetic field that's only 25% of what it is on Earth. That's a bit odd because you would expect a large, rocky planet to have a molten core, and hence have a strong magnetic field. But Gleba doesn't. Gleba's biomes. Gleba's biomes are very interesting. We have several that we might think of as fairly ordinary. There are two types of water, for example. A deep lake and a blue marsh. Note that there's apparently nothing resembling a sea or ocean on Gleba, despite it raining all the time. That suggests that while there's lots of water, there isn't the same sort of height variation that there is on the other planets. Not that Gleba is flat, there are cliffs. However, these cliffs are interesting. As we can see, they're covered in roots. This maybe suggests that they're more like large soil piles that have dropped away than actual proper rocky cliffs. We also have wetlands, one each for Yumiko and Jellynut, the things we grow on Gleba. There's also what Factoriopedia calls the natural soil for both of these. We then have two types of rock, a rock pit and a highland yellow rock. This therefore confirms that there is at least some harder silicon-based material on Gleba. It's not squishy all the way down. But we don't see any real evidence of volcanism or tectonic activity on Gleba. Again, there's nothing like rivers or evidence of erosion of the rock or anything like that. It's a remarkably flat and uniform planet. There are also a couple of more generically biological biomes. First off, we have something called bark, which is apparently turquoise. Quite what this is supposed to be, I'm not sure. A bark is the skin of a tree, so why a planet would have a bark, I don't know. Of course, it could be that there's some form of tree-like thing under the bark. That is, we're just seeing the bark of the trees as if it was the surface. But it's a very interesting term to use, especially given some of the other biome names. Let's pick up on this point later. Next up, we have some marshes, which come in green, light green, pink, and coral variants. as we'll see later, there is another coral on Gleba, so I'm guessing this coral marsh is referring to another living coral rather than a coral colour. But there's also a couple of weird variants of the marsh. Apparently there's a dead skin marsh, which is either normal or light. I'm again assuming that light refers to the colour rather than the weight or something else, but again, we're using a term that you would usually associate with an animal, skin, to refer to a biome on a planet. It's very odd, and it gets even odder because next up we have 4 types of red vein. This apparently comes in bright, dull, bulges, and dead forms. The first 2 again seem like colour references, but bulges and dead, these seem more descriptive of something organic than simply a terrain type. In other words, we're using even more terminology that's describing a living organism, rather than those we might usually use for the surface of a planet. And if all that wasn't weird enough, we've got an infection that is red. Again, this could all be explained by the engineer not really being able to tell the difference between plants and the surface. Plus, we do incorporate some references to plant life in earth biomes. Grassland and forest are descriptive of the plants that live there, for example. But let's also remember that the engineer has a very utilitarian approach to naming things. Biters bite and spitters spit. So them calling something dead skin and something else infection is very interesting. But again, more on that later. The final biome I want to touch on now is the very weirdly named blubber. There's several types: brown, 2 shades of olive, and then sickly, which is a very weird thing to call a biome. Blubber is the name usually given to the subcutaneous fat that a lot of sea animals have. Think seals and whales. It usually serves several functions, including acting as insulation, providing buoyancy, and as a big energy store. So why is there blubber on the planet itself? And how can this blubber be sickly? Very strange. Already we can see that several of the biomes are clearly organic in nature. And there's several more that are like plants being represented as a surface texture, rather than as freestanding organisms. So let's move on to plants next. Plant life. Okay, let's have a closer look at the plant life, or flora, on Gleba. First off, there's those biomes I mentioned that I think are more like plant descriptions than surfaces as such. There's mould, which comes in a cauliflower and red cauliflower form. But it also has another of these dead skin variants. However, this is actually phrased the other way around. That is, it's dead skin mould rather than mould dead skin. So to me, that's maybe actually saying it's mould on the dead skin rather than a mould the engineer is calling dead skin. The weirdness intensifies. Next up, let's touch on the plants in the game. I'm just going to rattle through these as there isn't a lot to say about some of them. Slipstack. Factorio says this is a Gleba coral stack that excretes blobs of slippery mucus. Sounds delightful, and, as noted in the biome section, this is the other coral. A coral is actually a type of animal, but the way its life cycle operates is a lot closer to the stromatolites that we'll get onto later. Corals form colonies, and, together, they grow large structures from their shells. Next up, we have 3 fungi. Funnel trunk. Factorio says this is a Gleba fungus that forms a hard outer funnel and cultivates symbiotic worms. So, it's another plant that's also maybe not really a plant. There's also some symbiotic relationship going on. Cuttlepop. This one is described as a Gleba fungus with tentacle-like roots and rattling spore pods. Quite what a rattling spore pod is, I'm not sure, but it's an evocative description, I'll give it that. Hairy clubnub. This amazingly named plant is described by Factorio as a Gleba fungus with hard woody stems and club-like caps that catch flies with sticky hairs. Note the confirmation there must be flies on Gleba. This also indicates there are carnivorous plants, which is then confirmed with our next one. Lickmore. Factorio directly tells us this is a carnivorous abomination with tongue-like tentacles and many mouths. Quite what it's eating, I'm not sure. Perhaps this also feeds on flies, but I could also see it maybe capturing newborn pentapods that get too close. Our next 2 plants, I don't really have any indication as to what they are. Teff lily. Factorio tells us this is a Gleba plant with strong plasticky leaves. Strong plasticky leaves sounds like an adaptation that provides toughness, Perhaps this one is more about resisting parasitism than it is about making mucus and catching insects. Water cane. Water canes have no description in the game, so I assume we can simply take them to be a normal, unremarkable Earth-like plant. Perhaps something like a reed or a bamboo based on the graphics. Our last big list is a whole slew of lichen. Lichen are actually a symbiotic colony, with fungi living in concert with either cyanobacteria or algae. Note again a theme of two different types of creature living in a mutually beneficial coexistence. Or at least that's how they are now. It could have been that one life form captured the other and is exploiting it. Anyway, first off, there are a whole load of biomes that are types of lichen. Dark, dry, cracked, cracked dark, cracked dull, orange crust, red crust, beige crust, and yellow crust. Next up we have 3 lichen that have become large plant-like organisms. Sunicome, a Gleba lichen with a sponge-like structure that accumulates a yellow crust when dried by the sun. Stingfrond, a Gleba lichen with a dry, wispy canopy that lowers exceptionally strong cords armed with tiny stinging barbs. So this guy's kind of dangerous. Boom puff, a Gleba lichen with pressurized gas sacs that ferments decaying matter into explosive gases. These last 2 are therefore particularly interesting. Boom puffs do actually explode in the game, doing damage. The stingfronds don't seem to be hazardous, but perhaps the engineers' clothes and armour are just tough enough to keep them safe. But, more importantly, they sound like something you'd see on a death world in Warhammer 40k. If we combine this with all the other references to carnivorous plants, then this gives us a strong feeling that Gleba is a very dangerous place to be. Anyway, there's 2 key flora left, the fruits and the bacteria, but I think both of those deserve their own sections. The fruits. There are 2 fruiting trees that become the focus of our agriculture on Gleba. The first is the Yamako tree, which provides the Yamako fruit. This is described in Factoriopedia as a tree that yields tasty, nutritious Yamako fruit. I think this is probably the most normal thing on Gleba. The fruit itself looks a little like a lychee, although one with a yellow centre rather than white. I confess, because it's so normal, I don't really have much more to say about it. The second fruiting tree is a lot weirder and therefore more interesting. The jelly stem is described as a Gleba abomination with a jelly-like stem and soft, fleshy lumps that grow wrinkled jelly nuts. I really don't know where to start with this. The fruit clearly looks like a brain. It has that characteristic wrinkly structure that provides a high packing density. If you're not aware, the reason your brain is wrinkly is because it's made of 2 parts. The neurons are located in the grey matter that's around the outside. These neurons are connected via axons that form a web through the central white matter. The wrinkliness is therefore about maximising the surface area for the grey matter. Note, however, that white and grey matter are really colour descriptions that come from looking at preserved dead brains. When alive, the brain's surface appears more pinkish due to all the blood vessels. And jelly nuts are pinkish. They also produce, as the name suggests, jelly, and the brain has a very jelly-like consistency. They're just bizarre. But, despite me speculating about it when they were first revealed in the Friday Facts, they don't really seem to have links to a living creature. Certainly, there's no link to the Pentapods, other than them eating them as a food source. However, I think it's something we can speculate about. As we've seen, many of the life forms on Nauvis straddle the line between being animals and plants. We've also got a lot of symbiotic relationships. Could jelly nuts be similar to either of these? Are the jelly trees intelligent life? Are the brains sentient? Do they know they're being harvested? It's a pretty grisly thought, but I guess maybe we can take some solace in the fact that if they are brains, then they won't feel anything. Brains don't actually have any pain receptors in them, so they can't feel directly. However, they are the place where pain signals from the rest of the body are processed and interpreted as pain. So I guess maybe the jelly nuts are in agony when we pick them? They just can't then feel themselves being processed into jelly. So that's all right then? Anyway, despite having all this horribleness, the fruiting trees don't really seem to tell us much about Gleba itself. other than that it's a pretty miserable place all around. That leaves us with the two bacteria that I've not talked about yet, the copper and iron stromatolites. Like the two fruits, they have much more significance for the player, so let's take a look at what they are in more detail as well. Stromatolite bacteria. We have two types of stromatolite-forming bacteria on Gleba, one that produces iron and the other copper. Clearly, these are aligned to the resources we use, but stromatolites are a real-life thing on Earth. They're created by colonies of bacteria in shallow seas. Hard material slowly builds up as new generations of bacteria grow and die. As such, while the individual bacteria live for a short time, the generations can build up a significant amount of material, the stromatolite. In the game, we can grow them artificially, and the Factorio version are therefore very fast. It does take time, but they produce enough material to be worth harvesting and smelting in seconds, rather than several thousand years. It is almost certainly accelerated for gameplay reasons, but the whole Nauvis system seems to operate on very short timescales. Days are very short on all the planets, and things change at incredible speeds. As I mentioned a few times, on one of my previous speculation videos, a commenter suggested that the engineer perhaps perceives time very differently to us. To them, a normal Earth day could be a few minutes, like in the game. Anyway, what's most interesting to me about them is where the bacteria are getting all this iron and copper from. We can assume that they're taking it from somewhere, but the question is, where? Another mystery. Pentapods. There's really only one type of large animal on Gleba, the pentapods. And I'm sure you'll already be familiar with them if you've ever tried to occupy Gleba. As such, I'm going to assume you're basically familiar with them and their life cycle. If not, it is explained in some detail in Friday Facts 424, which I'll link in the description. The quick summary is that they are a nesting species, a bit like the biters, with eggs that hatch into wrigglers. The wrigglers are the immature form, eventually growing up into strafers and stompers. Interestingly, while they do seem to prefer using the egg rafts, the strafers and stompers have the ability to lay eggs. They can even launch freshly hatched wrigglers at you as a weapon. It's also indicated that, though not depicted in the game, the different groups of pentapods are hostile to each other. They're competing clans. So that's the TLDR version of the Friday Facts. What I wanted to focus on here was one of the key contrasts between them and the biters. Their evolution. On Nauvis, the biters evolve in proportion to the amount of pollution we produce, as well as time and deaths. On Gleba, Pentapod evolution is based on the time and the amount of fruit that we produce. Time makes sense as a theme across the whole system, though again, it's interesting how accelerated everything is. Maybe there really is something more to that, but it's also a good way of ensuring a rising threat in the game, even if you're pretty inactive, passive or slow. But what I really wanted to discuss here is the nature of the evolution that the pentapods go through. In many ways, it's very similar to the biters' evolution. They get bigger and tougher the more evolved they are. But it's also a bit different. For the biters, they do get bigger, but early on they also introduce a new form. I didn't really discuss this much in my biter video, not least as it was enormous already, but when we first encounter the biters, they only produce the actual biters. That is, the mobile enemies that try to bite you as their attack. They're a bit like traditional worker ants in that way. There are worms from the start, of course, but what I mean is that they develop spitters. These guys aren't really like the biters, and while they're a bit like a mobile worm, they're also quite different. They're actually associated with a specific second type of nest, which is the only one able to spawn the spitters. This nest becomes more prevalent as evolution increases, replacing a good proportion of the original nest types that are only able to produce biters. This isn't like pentapods. All three types of pentapods, wrigglers, strafers and stompers, can all spawn from the beginning. As the evolution factor goes up on Nauvis, all three biter types, biters, spitters and worms, then undergo embiggening. Basically, the nests have an increased chance of producing bigger and bigger variants. In this way, the pentapods are similar. As the evolution factor goes up, there is more chance of the biggest pentapods being spawned. Okay. Where am I going with this? Well, I am wondering if the pentapod evolution is really evolution. Evolution means change and adaptation, and I think the biters do evolve. A new form emerges, responding to the pollution and adapting to the engineer's ability to use ranged weapons. It requires a new type of nest, and these become more prevalent, which is to say they compete with the old nests and steadily replace them. Even the growth aspect is more like evolution for the biters. The bigger biters don't just have a bigger health bar, their resistances change. This suggests their armour evolves and adapts to the engineer's weapons. They become better able to withstand certain types of damage, and not just because they're bigger. For the Pentapods, this doesn't happen. They get bigger and tougher, with stronger attacks, which are all interlinked effects in the way you'd expect, but they don't get additional resistances. All of the large pentapods have exactly the same resistances as small pentapods. In other words, the pentapods just get bigger. They don't change, they don't adapt, they don't evolve. Okay, so it's not evolution. Why do they get bigger at all? Well, the whole point of our interaction with the pentapods is that they eat the fruit. They're drawn to the fruit that we grow. So, what if they're actually getting bigger because we're farming their food on an industrial scale? Previously, they were resource restricted. Pentapods could only grow to a certain size because there was only so much food available. Now that we've created an abundance, they can grow to their full potential. They aren't really evolving, they're just better fed. And this isn't without precedent. If you look at the average size of people across time, you'll see that it has increased as calories have become more abundant. This is particularly marked in Western nations where industrialization of food production has made calories far more abundant and relatively easy to obtain. Simply having to unwrap a chocolate bar is a lot easier and more reliable than having to forage for your next snack. So I don't think the pentapods really evolve, and that makes me wonder how old they are as a species. While evolution is a constant process, the notion that it's all been gradual is not actually true. The Earth has experienced several cataclysmic extinction-level events. One of the most widely known is the extinction of the dinosaurs, likely caused by the impact of a massive asteroid, and possibly a period of extreme geological activity happening at the same time. But there have been others. The late Ordovician mass extinction, which killed 85% of all species. The late Devonian, which killed at least 70% of species. Permian Triassic, killing 81% of marine and 70% of land animals. Triassic-Jurassic extinction, killing off about 75% of species. And the Cretaceous Paleogene, which was the end of the dinosaurs. Well, not counting birds anyway. The point is that when you have a sudden extinction event, it creates gaps, known as niches, and new species can occupy these. So all those weird little mutations suddenly have an opportunity to thrive. They're not outcompeted like they are in a steady state system. There are no creatures already better adapted to that niche, so they can evolve to fill it. Gleba seems more like it's been in that steady state for a long time. So, to me, this all suggests that the pentapods have been there a long time. Or at least, they haven't evolved in a long time. So, what is Gleba? On the one hand, it could just be a normal planet, the one that's absolutely drowning in biology, but I think there's something more going on. Solar energy is the engine of life. With the exception of some deep-sea vent biospheres, on Earth all complex life ultimately derives its biological functions from solar energy. Plants get energy from photosynthesis, and that involves harnessing light. Some animals derive their energy from eating those plants, while others get energy from eating those plant eaters. It's a pyramid that derives from the sun. Planets that are closer to their sun receive more solar energy. We might therefore expect them to be more biologically active. Just to acknowledge it before you commenters do your thing, there's actually what's known as a Goldilocks zone for planets orbiting a star. The name comes from the fairy story, as the Goldilocks zone is a distance from the star where the amount of solar energy is just right for life. Vulcanus, Gleba, Nauvis and, formerly, Fulgora have all supported life. So I'm going to assume they're all in this Goldilocks zone for the Nauvis star. Planets that are closer than the Goldilocks zone receive too much energy, so life is less likely. Those planets further away than the Goldilocks zone receive too little energy for life to really get going. Note it's all to do with liquid water, actually. Anyway, I'm getting distracted. What? Me? Getting distracted and going down a rabbit hole? Never. The point I'm really getting to is that Nauvis is actually closer to the sun than Gleba, and yet it's Gleba that's drowning in biological life. It's Gleba that has the really big creatures that, presumably, have a very high calorific demand. I've talked more about the biters in another video, but to me this suggests there must be another source of energy. Gleba isn't as dependent on the energy from the sun when compared to Nauvis, and it's this other source of energy that is fueling this ecosystem. A hole in the ground. Something that's very obvious when you look at Gleba, but that I haven't mentioned yet, is this weird mark. On the planet icon there's a sort of scar that's shown on the planet's surface. Firstly, it's very dark, and to me that suggests it's very deep. I know I'm stating the obvious, but to be dark like that, it must mean there's a large area where light doesn't shine. And that means something that's either really deep or really high. Otherwise it couldn't create such a large shadow. In other words, somewhere on Gleba there's either some really big mountains or there's a really big hole. Mountains are a function of geological activity. They rise when continental plates interact, causing the line to rise up. This could either be through crinkling or things like subduction. Typically, the latter would also result in volcanoes. So, do we see anything that supports that on Gleba? Well, no. Gleba has hills and cliffs, but as I already pointed out, they're nothing like Volcanus or Nauvis cliffs. Of course, it could be that we've landed in the middle of a continental plate, so we don't really see too much of that. But, as I pointed out before, we don't see a single lake or river or sea or anything like that. And the cliffs seem to be more like landslips. As I noted, it all seems very flat. And if we look at the planet again, we can only see one place where there's this shape. I guess there could be more geology on the far side of the planet, but only having one set of extreme mountains on an entire half of a planet would be quite odd indeed. Therefore, to me, this is a hole of some sort. One thing of note about Gleba is that it seems to rain there almost constantly. So, if it's raining all the time, we'd expect any geological feature to be weathered pretty aggressively. Yet there's still this one massive hole. That, to me, suggests it's a really deep hole, otherwise it would have been weathered away by all this rain. Or, given how wet the place is, why hasn't it been filled up with water? In other words, why is it not a giant lake or sea rather than a big hole? It would have to be incredibly deep for that to be possible. So, let's review. It's a hole. It's so deep that water doesn't fill it. Perhaps it vaporizes and rises up before it can reach the bottom. And it's so large that it has parts that are in permanent darkness. It also seems to be unique on the planet. There's just one. One distinct possibility is that something has hit Gleba, but that five-pointed shape is a very weird one for an asteroid impact. A five-pointed shape, like the Pentapods. I mean, it's got to be something to do with the Pentapods, right? This can't be a coincidence, surely. Pentapod oranges. So, how about this? Gleba was hit by the mother Pentapod. While it died in the impact, the Pentapods we see are its children. But how could that be? Well, first off, we know that as they get bigger, they get tougher. And perhaps a pentapod that's at this scale wouldn't be completely eliminated by the impact. Now, while I don't think it would survive, perhaps the pentapods in its egg chamber did, and they would then be able to hatch. In Facts 424, they provided a general biology that included some information on their reproductive process. This showed them as a kind of internal egg-laying species. The infants could be kept internally until being birthed by their parents or laid in a raft. What wasn't described was any kind of sexual reproductive process. Now, in some ways that's irrelevant for what was being talked about, but to me this suggested an asexual process. You can watch my beta video for more on this concept, but in summary, it means the junior pentapods are essentially clones of the parent. Of course, that isn't necessary for this theory. The mother pentapod could simply have been pregnant when it crashed. But it does feel a bit more likely to me if it was able to spawn little clones of itself under any circumstance. These baby pentapods then grew up and colonised Gleba. However, because there's relatively small amounts of energy available from the plants, they're only able to grow to a relatively small size. Where this mother pentapod came from is an interesting question. One possibility is it's something to do with Bob, the shattered planet. Perhaps the pentapods were native to Bob, and when it was shattered, one of them flew off and hit Gleba. I'm not sure about this option, to be honest. To me, Bob's shattering was a recent event, and the pentapods have been there for quite a while. Another possibility is that it's some sort of interstellar traveller. Heck, perhaps this is how this species spreads. They could maybe grow so big that they're somehow able to get into space. Then they just drift until they hit another planet and spread across it too. This loops me back around to the evolution point. If this is a species that travels the stars, then perhaps it's a species whose evolution has essentially peaked. It's alive? I actually think the whole hitting the planet concept doesn't really explain the other thing I mentioned about Gleba. To me, Gleba seems to be far more biologically active than Nauvis, yet it's further from the Sun, so there should be less energy to drive that activity. So, how about this? The energy that's driving Gleba is Gleba itself. That is, what if Gleba is actually some planet-sized biological entity? And what if it's become the source of extra energy because it's dead? Then, this is a hole, but it's not one that was caused by something hitting Gleba. Instead, it's where the decaying matter erupts from, and it's this decay that's driving the Gleba biology. There could be heat from the decay, and it's likely to produce a lot of biological matter that could then form fuel for the bacteria. This could even explain where the stromatolites are getting the metals from. They're part of this decaying Gleba lifeform, and the bacteria are simply concentrating it. The Pentapods have then simply evolved from the various creatures that would be feeding on the Gleba creature corpse. I appreciate I've gone for a bit of a weird and wacky theory there, but is there anything else to support this? Well, in the early parts of the video on the biomes and flora, I pointed out several weird names. Bark, blubber, veins, red infection, dead skin, mould. As I mentioned before, blubber is a layer of fat and would therefore need to have some sort of veins in it to carry blood. Some of it is apparently sickly, and the colours, brown and olive, feel like descriptions of infected flesh. Could all these be related? And remember, some of the veins were described as bulging, something that would happen if they were infected, and other veins were described as dead, just like the skin. Could these be related too? And then, of course, we have mould, which is, again, somehow related to the dead skin. Mould could have grown on the dead skin, or maybe it could be the cause of the dead skin. There was also a description of some plants being carnivorous and feeding on flies. You know, those things that are drawn to decay. And we have two fungi, again an organism that feeds on decay. For me, this is all more evidence that whatever Gleba was, it was a living creature, and it's now dead. Whether it was part of the Nauvis system or it drifted here is another question. I already consider Bob to be a rogue planet. Perhaps Gleba was too? Perhaps they originated in the same system and were flung off in the same event. I'm going to be chatting about Prometheum in the next lore video, so perhaps there's some link there too. Well, I hope you enjoyed this rather random and, to be totally frank, rather weird speculation video. I quite like the idea of Gleba being some bizarre planet capable of interstellar travel. When we find it, it's simply died and started to decay before drifting into the Nauvis system where, the Nauvis star captures it and here it remains. I believe it's been confirmed that Gleba's name comes from the Czech word for soil. Interestingly, that ties in quite well with it being some sort of big planet-sized animal that is now decaying and is therefore now the soil for all of this new life. But it's also interesting that Gleba is the term for a fungal spore thing as well. Anyway, Gleba is an odd place and I think it deserves an odd explanation. Do any of these sound like plausible theories to you, or do you have any different ideas? Let me know what you think in the comments, and in the meantime, if you want to know why I think the shattered planet was shattered, then click on the video on screen now. In my Fulgora video, I speculated a bit about why the Fulgorans didn't move to any of the other planets in the system. I think this might be a good candidate for explaining why they didn't go to Gleba. If there was no Gleba at the time when their species was thriving, then they could hardly have considered moving there, could they?